morning, everyone. Appreciate this opportunity to be with you here this morning on this Saturday, beautiful day. Today I'll be talking to you about water, basically where your water comes from. When you turn on the faucet or when you irrigate outside, where's that water come from? I'll be talking a little bit about all the water agencies and other agencies that help to manage water. I deal with a watershed agency called the Santa Ana River Watershed Project Authority. It's the Santa Ana River Watershed. And we are basically working on a watershed basis. And so I'll be talking a lot about watersheds. I'll be talking about the challenges that we're facing ahead of us, some things that might affect you in very soon, and what we're doing about it. So with that, let's go ahead and jump right in. First, the setting, the Santa Ana River Watershed. It's the largest coastal stream system here in Southern California. It covers about 2,840 square miles. We have about 6 million people who live in this watershed. Just to give you a sense of where this is, if you look at this map up in the San Bernardino Mountains, that's where it starts, up near Big Bear Lake. Continues on down through Seven Oaks Dam, through San Bernardino, Riverside, and continues on down to the Prado Basin. And if you drive along the 91 freeway, you see this big dam. It used to say 200 years of freedom, but then graffiti artists sort of changed that. That's holding back the Prado Basin at the Santa Ana River itself. It's a flood control facility. And it continues on down eventually onto Orange County to Huntington Beach, where it flows out under big rain events out into the ocean. These are the main water agencies that we deal with. The Santa Ana Watershed Project Authority, being a joint powers authority, has 5 member agencies, and these are our 5 member agencies. If we were to look at a map, we're roughly looking at this arrow located right about there. That's where we're looking, almost right in the center of the entire watershed. We have quite a few resources. These are pictures really of the Santa Ana River as it flows down, starting up in the top left-hand corner. Big Bear Lake continues on down to right below it is to Prado Basin. That's a picture of right behind that dam where a big rain event occurred and basically flooded behind the dam into Prado Basin. Continues on down to Orange County. Orange County does a great job trying to capture all that flow whenever they can. They have these things called T-levees that basically capture that flow and sink it down to the ground. And then the final bottom right, there's the Huntington Beach outfall. This river basin is a bit different than most of river basins that you see out there. This is sort of a comparison of the Mississippi. Santa Ana River goes from about 1,880 feet in elevation down to a sea level in only about 96 miles, while the Mississippi River takes about roughly the same elevation drop over 2,320 miles, much more slow, meandering type of river compared to the Santa Ana River. So the comparison, the drops in Santa Ana River is about 19.5 feet in elevation per mile, while comparison the Mississippi River only drops about 0.6. As you can imagine, under rain events, very fast-moving water. And with that fast-moving water, a lot of force and some things that have been a real problem for us. Particularly under big fire events, we have a lot of sediment, and you read about this in the news, no doubt. Montecito was really hit by a massive amount of sediment, and then with flood events, it can really be really devastating to downstream communities. Back in 1969, this is actually the Van Buren Bridge, River Bridge near on the Santa Ana River. A big flashy storm came along and wiped out that bridge. We've done a lot of work to try to improve the flood control situations. These are basically the agencies that are involved. There's a federal level, state level, and the local level. A lot of folks concerned about the flood risk to the adjoining property along these tributaries and rivers. This is quite a long list of agencies that are thinking about these things. It's also important to know, though, that during the summer months, we don't have a lot of water. Obviously not a lot of rain. And so much of the water flow that you see in the Santa Ana River is actually treated wastewater. It's highly treated wastewater. Now, we recognize that a lot of people like to go out there and recreate. If you ever see pictures sometimes in the Press Enterprise or other newspapers, you'll see people out there enjoying. So the Regional Water Quality Control Board is very aware of that, and they make sure that all those wastewater treatment plants that take that wastewater and drop it into the river, treated to a very high degree. Disinfection. I mean, it's amazing the levels of treatment. City of Riverside recently expanded their treatment plant, and they're using state-of-the-art technology to clean that water up before it's ever released, so people, when they can go out there and recreate in it, aren't at risk at all from bacteria or pathogens. The Santa River, in fact, is a source of drinking water. The river is actually used as it continues on down, as I mentioned before, down into the local areas down in Orange County, and it drops down into their groundwater basin. But also in the very upper portions, you actually have mountain flows, and there is some surface water capture that occurs and is part of the drinking water supply. The river also contains a lot of diversity, lots of different habitat, fish, wildlife species, plant species. Some of them are endangered. The fish there that you see is called the Santa Ana sucker. It is a threatened species. Its populations have significantly diminished over time, and there's a lot of effort to try to help restore this species of fish, as well as many bird species as well. These are the agencies that are involved in helping to manage that habitat, federal, state, and local entities. All of them are working together to see what they can do to help restore the populations of these species. The river is also mostly a soft bottom river. If you were to compare this river to, say, LA River is mostly paved over. And it's big, giant channels. You see pictures of that under big rain events. People get into that, and they're just swept right out into the ocean. Here we have a mostly unconcreted type of river. And with that, it's a real benefit because so much of that water actually percolates down through the soil into groundwater basins. So it's a pretty important feature. In fact, here within our Santa Ana River Watershed, over 50% of your water supply comes from groundwater, and which is really great because groundwater is so much less expensive than bringing imported water in. And I'll talk a little bit more about the other supplies of water. But in the San Bernardino and Chino Basin, up in San Jacinto as well, Orange County, all these are massively large groundwater basins. And if we're able to capture that water and sink it into the ground, percolate it, we have that water available to us so we can pump it out when times of drought occur, and it's an important supply. It's also an important corridor. Recreation and wildlife all use this corridor to move around and enjoy. These are the various agencies that are in charge of land management and oversight. You can see quite a range of them. We span 4 counties, for the most part 3 counties, but we do have a little sliver of LA County out in the Pomona area. So 62 cities with lots of planning that they're having to oversee. A little bit more about the agencies. Within our Santa Ana River Watershed, we have a lot of different agencies, a lot of different folks who are involved with water. We have folks who are like Western Municipal Watershed. Your host here today is one of our wholesale agencies. They're also a retail agency. They actually have customers who come in and pay their bill, and so they have this joint role of being a wholesale agency that brings in imported water, and also the role of providing retail water to customers directly. Our other member agencies, some of them are strictly groundwater agencies, some have that dual role as well. Eastern, for example, is probably one of the largest ones. Some of you might be customers of Eastern Municipal Water District. They have the dual role of wastewater treatment as well as water treatment. They're a wholesale agency as well as a retail agency. So lots of different roles here. Really depends on where you're at. Some of you might even be served by small community service districts or mutual water districts. Oftentimes those are small agencies that just have a few wells, groundwater wells. They created a small entity to govern that, and they have been doing that for years. So there's a few of those as well. So there's a broad mix of agencies. Each of them have their own governance, and one would think, okay, why don't you all just combine together? Well, there's a lot of push for local control, and so you won't see that happening probably anytime soon. So, big question, where does my water come from? When you turn on the faucet. In general, if you look in your books there that you have, the yellow books, we do talk a little bit about the sources of water and the percentages. And those percentages I show in the book are really for the Santa Ana River Watershed. But each agency, though, has a different mix of where that water comes from. Generally, most of it, as mentioned before, is groundwater, some almost 90% groundwater. But here within our watershed, about 50 to 60% of it's groundwater. We also have what is known as the state project water. That's water coming from Northern California. That's brought down here through the state water canal, and that is roughly about 25% of our supply. It's very good quality water. That's pristine water that comes all the way down from Northern California. I also have Colorado River water. This is from the Colorado River Aqueduct. There's one agency called the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, and they're the responsible entity for bringing that water, imported water, into Southern California. If we didn't have that water coming in, we'd be pretty much like a Phoenix, very dry, very, very dry. And it's very important, particularly with the population growth that we're seeing throughout this entire region. And of course, also some captured surface water. Some of the agencies that are right at the foot of the mountains, they do a great job of trying to capture that surface water. The other big part of this, and shown is about 10 to 15% of the overall supply, is actually recycled water for irrigation needs and recharge. We actually sometimes take that recycled water and sink it down through the soil, and the natural soil cleans up the water as it goes through the soil. Later on, as it migrates over to quite a distance over to drinking water wells, it's pumped out and treated one more time and then sent out to the public. So you might be drinking recycled water, but that just mimics the natural hydrology of rain and the processes of how water evaporates and is used and goes back up into the atmosphere. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of concern about the future and looking out into the future, looking at the Santa Ana River Watershed. Here's the population projections that were done a few years back, but at the time, these actually are looking pretty much on track. We're right now at about 6 million, and here we are in 2018, and that graph is pretty accurate so far. 4 million new residents. That's, one can imagine 2 cities of Chicago's being plopped right into our watershed. The number of people that are going to be here. And you think to yourself, well, I don't hear about mass migrations of new people moving to California. Aren't they all moving out? Well, what it is babies. Lots of new babies. And, you know, the people living here just have raising their families, and it's growing, and just by that natural growth, it is occurring. So they all need water. Also, the industry and institutions are changing. We used to be here within our watershed primarily an agricultural dairy type of environment, but now all that's transformed. Lots of construction, urban development, a lot of new industries coming in. You may have heard about Amazon seeking to locate out in this area. Of course, entertainment is a big part of it. We have Disneyland and Knott's Berry Farm, all within our watershed, and these are big drivers as well. The demand is changing, the type of demand, moving from the agricultural type of demand over to more the multifamily, single family, and industry and commercial development. So, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Tell a little more about the challenges that we're facing here. These are out there, and they're scary, very scary guys here. And I'll tell you a little bit about each one of these. First off, as I mentioned before, population increase. We know that population is occurring, but how we develop will be the path that we need to be aware of for the future. Are we going to continue with the urban sprawl, just continue our past practices? With this sprawl, oftentimes we cover over all these natural areas that we had used to have open and actually recharge the water into the groundwater basins. But with the pavement, it just captures that water and runs it off right into the tributaries and into the river and out into the ocean really quickly. So there's a lot of effort to try to find locations that are dedicated recharge locations. But also in how we develop, the state now has new requirements called low impact development. And all these new developments have to be aware of how they use water. They have to capture water on site and sink it whenever they can. And also there's big emphasis on water conservation and water use efficiency, that all these developments, you won't see the big sprawling green lawns out in the front yards anymore. That will simply be not a practice for the future. Also an awareness that this population, this growth, has an impact on energy. We have to be much more aware of the tie between water. Water is important for producing energy, but also by our use of water, it actually uses energy. And how we implement this within our homes, the energy use efficiency as well as water efficiency devices, these are all important for the future if we were to have a sustainable future. Years ago, there was a big, we could always count on the federal government to help with subsidizing big water projects, but the federal government is not quite as much of a handout as we used to have, so we're relying more on local and regional and state resources to help implement these projects. The other threat we have also is the threat to the flow of water from the Colorado River. This is a map that shows that huge river basin that captures that water, and even they in the western United States are experiencing these times of low rainfall and less water coming into the basin. It's a challenge to ensure that water is continuing. If you ever go out to Lake Powell and see the dry water rings around the edges, it gives you a sense of how much that water level has dropped. Sometimes you have some years that it's getting closer, it gets better, but then, as you might recall, just prior to this year, we had a 6-year span of a drought season, and it was pretty scary for particularly folks out in Las Vegas who are very dependent upon the water that goes along the Colorado River into Lake Mead, and that reservoir is really dropping. And here's a picture of that. You see those white rings there around the lake itself, and that they're expecting that if we don't have rainfall, that will just continue to drop. You'll see more of those rings, and the concern is that that could actually have a big impact even on energy production. The other area in which we have some concerns about is our ongoing supply from Northern California, our state water project. This is a snapshot of the Sacramento San Joaquin River Delta. There is a lot of endangered species up in that area that are counting on regular flows. There is various salmon types of species that subsist, and they're required now to release certain flows through these tributaries. The amount of water that used to be pumped down to Southern California and to Central California and other locations is not as reliable as it used to be. It's understood that there needs to be a balance so that we're protecting these habitats up in the Delta, but also providing water that's necessary for survival down here in Southern California. So the state has proposed various improvements and fixes. You might have heard about the California water fix to put in 2 large pipelines underneath the ground to bypass some of these levees that are shown here and bring that down to Southern California. When times are plentiful, we want to capture that water. When I say plentiful, sometimes Northern California, as we saw a year or so back, gets a lot of snow, a lot of moisture. We don't get as much here in Southern California, it seems, but they do. And when those times of plenty occur, we want to be able to capture that and bring that down and not lose it to the ocean. And so that's part of the fix that's associated with that project. Endangered Delta Smelt, as I mentioned before, required reduction in pumping. There is a lot of state and federal laws that require us to make sure that we're preserving these species for the future, and that has an impact on how much water we can pump down. This is a picture of the state water project delivery system. When it comes down to Southern California, it actually has to be pumped over the mountain range, the Tehachapi's, and then it eventually falls into our LA Basin and the Santa Ana Watershed area. Climate change. As I was introduced, I'm very much involved with sustainability, and it's a recognition that we have largely been using resources that we can't count on for the future, and that it has an impact on our environment. And we're seeing that that is now impacting us in various ways. The predictions, we've done a lot of work with the Bureau of Reclamation, and they did some studies for the Santa Ana River Watershed, and what we can expect for the next 30 to 50 years are more extreme events, longer periods of drought, flasher storm events, increased temperatures, and less snowpack. And how do we know this? We've done a lot of studies, and And we also know that even before all the discussions about climate change, we've had some extreme droughts. Back in looking at tree rings, we've had droughts as much as 40 years long. Imagine, we just went through a 6-year drought and all the news and press about it. Imagine a 40-year drought. It would probably change our lives significantly. As mentioned before, climate change or global warming has impacts in so many areas. It is something that we need to be aware of, need to adapt to, and make sure that we are moving forward with sustainable infrastructure and sustainable development so we can meet our demands. Back in 2015, we just had finished, we went through a rather extraordinary period of time of 6 years of drought. Recently, just prior to the recent rains, they had this similar type of press conference, and we're at about 3% of normal up there. It is pretty scary stuff, so we might be entering another phase of drought here in California. So about a year ago, people would say, okay, the drought's over, right? We had a lot of rain last year, and especially in Northern California. They were breaking records with snowpack and rainfall. And you ask yourself, okay, so do we not have to worry about this anymore? Well, the state is saying not so fast. Even though they had declared an emergency drought status, we still need to be mindful that these droughts, as shown by the tree rings, and basically we're seeing from climate change predictions that we shouldn't just take it for granted that we can get back into normal. This is the new normal. The fact that we really need to be conscious of our water, to be aware of how we use that water and understand where it comes from, it's how it's used in our homes and where it goes after we use it. And not all the areas of the state have recovered. Northern California, they got a lot of snowfall. It's great. A lot of the agricultural areas, that's great. But every year they're dependent upon that snowpack. And if you don't have that snowpack, it's scary stuff. Groundwater basins are still very low. And we've had multiple years where we need that replenishment, and it'll take a while for that to be totally back to normal. And the development continues, population continues, and we're still very dependent upon outside imported water. A little bit about our agency, the Santa Ana Watershed Project Authority. What we're doing about this, as I mentioned before, we're a joint powers authority, and we're basically focusing on a watershed approach to dealing with the challenges for the future. Our agency has been around since formally formed back in '75, but prior to that, we were a planning agency in the late 60s, and we were formed primarily because the upstream parties and the downstream parties were suing each other over water rights. There was a lot of growth that was occurring in Orange County. They needed that water, and they recognized that their groundwater basin was dependent upon those flows down the Santa Ana River, so they started suing. And eventually they reached a settlement, and this was the 1969 stipulated judgment or physical solution. A certain amount of water would always flow down to Orange County of a certain quality. We were formed as part of that to help basically avoid litigation, get people together and start chatting and working together. And one of the member agencies is Western Municipal Water District, and we have 4 other ones that we work with. They meet on a monthly basis, and we're the staff. There's about 25 of us who are a part of this organization. One of our first projects that we kicked off when we started as an agency was known as the Santa Ana Regional Interceptor Brine Line, which now has been renamed the Inland Empire Brine Line. The Inland Empire Brine Line is basically a salt disposal pipeline. It is a pipeline that takes high saline water that you can't put into your wastewater treatment plants, takes it and sends it down to Orange County. It's treated one time before it eventually goes out to the ocean. It's something that you can't use any further. This brine line was started down in the Orange County area and it's continued on up. It now extends up into San Bernardino and all the way down to Lake Elsinore. It's about 80 miles long. The reason why we address this is because there's so much salt being added. Many of you might remember when you're in your history books this valley in the Middle East called Mesopotamia. And it was a beautiful, fertile land at one time, rich with agriculture. And then over time, it got saltier and saltier and saltier and eventually became, in essence, almost a wasteland. This is what we don't want to happen for the Santa Ana River Watershed, because all these salts are coming in, and just by human use, by industry use, and also the salts within some of the source water that we have, it adds to the groundwater basin. The groundwater basins naturally are pretty pristine, but if it becomes too salty, we can't use it. So it's important that when we put in technologies like desalination, there's always a separation of highly saline brine and the good quality water. What do you do with that brine? And what we do is we put it into a pipeline, sent down to Orange County. It mixes in with their one treatment plant near the oceans, near in Huntington Beach, and then eventually, after treatment, is disposed out into the ocean. The length of the pipeline is about 93 miles, spans various sizes. We move about, have a capacity of about, right now, about 30 million gallons per day. Lots of industries connect to this, desalination plants, even some power generation plants. Sometimes they have a byproduct and it's very salty, and they can't send it to a wastewater treatment plant because they can't reclaim it. If it's too salty, they can't be able to use it for irrigation purposes. So this is a very important pipeline. It's the salt level is about 2,200 to 4,000 milligrams per liter, or parts per million. And if you look at ocean water, it's about 50 to 60,000 milligrams per liter. So a lot less salty than ocean water, but still a problem for our groundwater basins here in the Santa Ana River Watershed. Another primary activity that I'm responsible for here is what we call the roundtables. I, with my staff, work as a facilitator, bringing multiple agencies together to work on common issues. We form these, what are known as task forces or work groups. Many agencies oftentimes have new regulations they have to deal with, and having these entities come together under a single agreement, an MOU agreement, they're able to work on problems jointly rather than individually. It saves us a lot of money, and we often will be the facilitator, we'll bring on a consultant or the monitoring contractors to help us find solutions for the future. It is a path that will be promoted into the future. It is now seen as an example of how things should be done. SAPA, my agency, has been recognized by the state as a path forward. We really do need more watershed entities like this that can get people around the table and talking, collaborating, finding joint multi-beneficial solutions. The other arena which I'm very much involved with is long-term integrated regional water planning. We call our plan one water, one watershed, recognizing all the water is really one water within our watershed. It's just simply used different times and has different levels of treatment and reused. We recognize that this is a very precious resource. We want to make sure that it is being used in a fashion that it will be sustainable for the future. Our plan is currently being updated. It is a very different type of plan. The plan actually, for the most part, is written by the stakeholders. We actually got people who are interested in various aspects of water strategies to come together in various groups, and they actually looked at the issues, the problems, the challenges, and then worked together to come up with solutions in a very integrated fashion. And they actually wrote the chapters of this document, which is very, very different, because usually most other agencies will say, okay, let's find out a good consultant. They'll go out and maybe do some interface, a few public meetings, and write the plan. This is a plan that's written by the stakeholders. With that comes a lot of buy-in and support, and we're very proud of this plan. It's been recognized by the state as an example for the future as well. So this is the governance on down below. We call the work groups pillars, our underpinnings of this plan. We have a steering committee composed of county representatives and city representatives, as well as water agencies who provide some oversight of the plan, and then SAPA Commission. This is our governance that meet on a regular basis each month. Our new plan has just been updating its goals and objectives. We came to a consensus on that recently. We're following the new requirements by the state to how these plans should be developed. We're focusing particularly on interests of water quality remediation, looking at climate change vulnerabilities. One thing about about climate change is that it's not something that is debated anymore among the water resource agencies. It is something that is, if you're not addressing it, you're not doing your job. The state is mandating it. This is something that we all must realize that it is something that we have to adapt for. And so this is, I think, pretty important an awareness that we are now past the question of what is causing it. It is a question of dealing with it, mitigating, and developing strategies to adapt to it. Here's some of the strategies that we're looking out into the future, ways to address this. First on the watershed, the very top one, the watershed hydrology and ecosystem protection. If we can do things more in the upper watershed, maybe up in the forest areas, to capture water, to help thin some of the forest lands, we could sink that water in, have fewer forest fires, fuels reduction. These are strategies that would help us out so that downstream we have less water quality problems, less sediment transport, and less flooding that oftentimes is a result of this massive either fires or poorly overgrown forest areas. Demand reduction, water use efficiency, this is what we describe as the low-hanging fruit. The biggest bang for a buck is to get people to understand if they can just use water much more efficiently, it can go much farther. Give you an example of this. Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, about 10 years ago, began to really push for low-flow toilets and low-flow showers. And they gave these appliances to all these water agencies and say, okay, give these rebates out. We want people to change. And all the new developments now have low-flow and low-flow shower heads. And by that savings, despite the population growth that's occurred, they are still providing the same level, the same amount of water as they did 10 years ago, which is extraordinary. You think to yourself, wow, that is amazing. Because despite all these, massive number of people have moved in here with all their water demand, we've still been able to stretch that water even further. Operational efficiencies and transfers, basically getting agencies to work together, be able to move water around. Oftentimes we have a pipeline out there, we just need to come up with strategies to accomplish that. We're doing this one large one right now called the Santa Ana Watershed Conservation Conjunctive Use Project. And it's basically to store more water in the ground whenever we have plenty of water. Innovative supply alternatives. The technology has really changed now, and we've been able to use a very advanced treatment of wastewater, so we are able to actually capture that water and then sink it into the ground directly. Recycled water facilities, as well as desalination plants. These are technologies that have improved and are being applied. And remediation cleanup is really pretty much down at the end of the train of improvement. We recognize that sometimes past missteps of our society used to dump waste directly into the ground, not realizing that has an impact on groundwater basins. And so oftentimes we have these remediation cleanups that we have to do, and that's all part of the overall picture of our strategies for the future. When we did our plan, we broke, as I mentioned before, all these groups into pillars, and these are the various strategies and working groups. Each one of them have developed the chapter within our OWOW plan, but we also encourage them to talk to each other, even among these pillars, to come up with multi-beneficial projects. We don't want them to be silos. We don't want them just to be focused on one area. And in the end, through their efforts, we will have a joint effort, what we call One Water, One Watershed. We're, as mentioned before, recognized for its watershed approach by the state of California as the path for the future. What are the benefits of this approach? Here's a long list, but overall you'll see pretty significant savings of water, and water that is now captured and sunk into the groundwater basin, environmental habitats restored, pollution cleaned up, flood risk reduced, and also creating lots of jobs. So this has all been a significant benefit of our watershed-wide approach. A little bit more back to water use efficiency. I know this being a Master Gardener's workshop, water use efficiency, particularly among your gardens, are really important. I know that there's been several agencies who have a program called Inland Empire Garden Friendly that has been encouraging people to look at how they use their water and go to more the drip systems or micro sprayers to irrigate their plants. This is important, as I mentioned before, for the future and how we deal with drought responses. Our watershed is also focusing on areas that you might see along the streets. You might, in the past, see a lot of these medians that are grass covered, turf covered, and now you'll see more of the transition towards drought-tolerant types of plantings. We're also doing a lot of work to help agencies who are interested in what are known as water budget-based rates, basically establishing a budget for individual residents of how much water would normally be used if you were really efficient, and try to encourage people by increasing rates as you use more water to incentivize you to maybe look at being within a budget. Western Municipal Water District as well as Eastern Municipal Water District practice this type of water rate, and it is the path for the future. But they have to understand what each individual residence is doing. So we're able to use aerial survey and GIS, Geographic Information Systems, to help us see each individual site to help you establish a budget for your area. There's a lot of outreach tools now. You can actually have on your phone a way to track your water use, and these tools are out there that are currently being used. As I mentioned before, forest first, if we look at the upper watershed, over 33% of our watershed is covered by forests. But about 90% of the precipitation actually lands in the forest lands. So if we work closely with forest agencies, we'll be able to deal with that, deal with the challenges on a watershed basis. We also need to be always cognizant of the flood risk out there. Prado Dam is one part of that. We also have Seven Oaks Dam, to avoid those big flood events that wiped out property downstream. This is a back picture or front picture of the dam, as well as the overflow facility on the right-hand side. This recently was raised, recognizing there's a lot of development in the upper watershed, and with that, more water runs off, so they had to raise the dam to account for that. Recycled water for the future is going to be pretty important. The percentage that you saw in your book, 10 to 15%, that will continue to increase. More and more technology, as mentioned before, is out there, and we recognize this is a valuable resource we don't want to lose. Eastern Municipal Water District takes all their recycled water and they reuse it. And it's a great thing. And many other agencies are doing the same thing. It is an alternative water supply that can be cleaned up. Here within our watershed, we use it multiple times before it's lost eventually out to the ocean. And it is our path for the future. Another piece of technology is desalination. A lot of you might have heard about desalination at the oceans. Frankly, desalination at the seawater edge is one of the most expensive sources of water you can ever imagine. It just takes so much energy to desalt the ocean. You remember the salt levels, 50 to 60,000 milligrams per liter? It's a challenge. And that's why we only have like one major desalter down here in Southern California. That's recently the Carlsbad desalination plant that was opened. They finally found a partner in economics to finally have that work out. But you'll be amazed by the number of groundwater desalination plants, much less salty than the ocean and much more efficient. It is actually getting as reasonable, as economical to desalt groundwater when you have some contaminants in the groundwater, maybe too much salt or nitrate. In comparison of that at groundwater that's treated compared to imported water, they're beginning to be almost the same price now. So this is great. The technology and the membranes have also improved. So it's a path that's very promising for the future, and we'll continue to do that. Here's a snapshot of our watershed with all the groundwater basins. And so you can see there that there's a rich supply of basins that we can utilize, hope to recharge, and continue to use into the future. We're one of the watersheds here in Southern California that has a lot of groundwater basins. If you go down to San Diego, they have hardly any. It's almost like just small little basins that are not very productive. They're almost totally dependent upon imported water or now their ocean desalination plant. Land use planning. We recognize that we need to continue our dialogue with even the land use planning community. There is always a tie, like in general plans, as general plans are developed by cities. Oftentimes there now is a component about how water is used. You might have heard about the model landscape ordinances. These are ordinances that are now passed and required to be passed by individual cities that recognize how water is used. I used to work for the city of Colorado Springs years and years ago, and I remember when I was in the engineering public works department, we would never go upstairs and talk to the land use people. They were the planners. You know, that's the planning division, and we're down here, the engineering division. And we were as different as a cow and a dolphin. And but now it's recognizing that we need to be communicating, talking to each other, and planning for the future, a sustainable future. This is a path forward that we need to be aware of. Disadvantaged communities. This is an arena that is becoming more and more important, and something that's important to the state of California. Many cities are addressing this issue. It is, for disadvantaged communities, is shown by this map. This is reflected by income levels. They show this by the levels of income that people have, and if you're below a certain area, that is shown here on the map. This also spreads out into other arenas, underrepresented communities, even issues of homelessness. This is something that we have now been asked by the state to devote grant monies to help look how there might be a coordination among the water industry and the homeless. Why would we be so concerned about the homeless? Well, it turns out that when the homeless go out into the riverbeds, they oftentimes have no sanitation. They have no portable potties. They have no places to go to the bathroom. They use their, wash themselves and do everything they can within the waterways. This causes bacteria to be increased in these waterways. And the regional board, the Santa Ana Regional Water Quality Control Board, has limits on these pathogens. And so they have an impact. Also, they have an impact. Sometimes they put in little dams, little mini dams, where they can create a little bit of water, like a little pool where they can go down and wash. And that changes the habitat. You remember the Santa Ana sucker that we talked about earlier? That destroys that habitat. In addition, there is a flood risk to these people. They're down there in tributaries. Big rainstorm comes along. They're at really a high risk. And the other main thing is that they are human beings. We have to recognize that, particularly that even in the states, recognize we have an obligation to serve water to even those who are homeless. So there's a dialogue going on right now, and it is something that the state is very concerned about, and we're seeking to at least have a dialogue with those social agencies and see what the water agencies can do to work with them on joint multi-beneficial types of efforts. In closing, the last few slides here, drought impacts for the future. We are facing some real challenges. Things are not going to get better as far as the frequency of rain events. When it does rain, it'll probably be more severe. You'll hear about these things more and more in the news as time goes on. What do we do in response? Well, we try what we can to adapt. And adaptation means that we need to just be aware of these challenges, to plan for more supply capture, to do more treatment of the water that we have. And also, as I mentioned, the low-hanging fruit, just get people to recognize that we're in a semi-arid environment. Not quite as bad as Phoenix, but almost there. And we used to think that all the lawns and green, we could just keep on watering and taking from Northern California, and it just lasts that way forever. Well, we recognize now that that's depleting a resource that is no longer there, and we need to adapt to that. So our future looking at the future, we want a watershed that is sustainable and resilient. We're capturing more storm water. We're reusing our water, ensuring that we're using it effectively, that we're aware of how the water is used, and as we think about future generations, that people who move here and our kids and their kids, that they'll have enough water for their needs. So with that, I close, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.